Hello, this is episode 43 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. And this time we're going to wrap up with the IRB proposal for the second product, and then we'll return to revisions on the first product. I think that's the gist of where we are. So, so the IRB proposal, finished that up, and that incorporates the changes we discussed last time, where we revised the hits to move away from trying to differentiate between three potentially related terms that came out of the first product, and refocused on the singular term readability. So the proposal changed to incorporate those newly focused hits. So let me just share my screen here.
Yeah, I like that move. I think it got, the more we talked through it last time, that notion of and I think particularly on the heels of reading that ethnography of Turkers that you shared, is looking less at the differentiation in the terms and more the way it would appear to Turkers in terms of compensation level and stuff like that. I think just makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. So, potentially that piece may be something to incorporate into the second product when we're talking about, probably methods about, why we did what we did.
Yeah.
We can certainly point to that piece as being one that sort of dictates, ways to set this up in a way that's appropriate to the platform. We also have, ethical guidelines from services like Turkopticon that give us some guidance on ethical compensation, that kind of thing. So it's definitely incorporated into the IRB proposal. Because it helps explicate, here's why we're setting the compensation rates the way we're setting them, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think what'll be interesting too in that second piece, potentially around methods, is similar to what we did with the first piece. The way we embedded some of those video discussions is the conversation we have with Kegel about working with participants versus subjects, and how that squared and didn't square with how the Turkers view themselves. So that sort of I think their response to what they feel is potentially sort of paternalism on the part of academics. Weirdly, how we would go in thinking they might want to be treated doesn't fully map on to actually how they articulate the way they want to be treated. So it's that was really interesting, I think. To see that merge, and that might be some part of the second product, is what were our expectations of how to treat them, and how did that map onto IRB, and how did that map onto the kinds of things we read about Turkers themselves or other previous ethnographic or academic work on them. And there's some distinctions across those.
Yeah. Excuse me. Okay. So looking at the hits here, you can kind of see how that shift has manifested in the way this kind of breaks. And I guess I can pull this up since I also use it in the IRB proposal. So the first round, right, there's two rounds. The first round is broken into 4 categories based on the kind of media we're examining. the video clip, the audio clip, the image, the paragraph of text. I'm assuming you're seeing this.
Yes.
Then within each one, there are 2 subcategories focused on language that illuminates whether it's describing the task primarily or how long it's going to take. And then each one of those is broken into 3 different compensations. So 24 in total at the first round. We can kind of see the difference here. So this is task instructions, summarize an audio clip, right? Summarize a 20-second audio clip in 1 sentence. So it's describing the task. You can see the reward. The other compensation ones are identical except for the amount of compensation offered. The ones that focus on the other media are identical except for their references to the thing, right? So summarize an image versus summarize an audio clip, but otherwise those are identical. The main difference kind of occurs here when we shift to instructions focused on the time. So I will have time instructions audio clip. So it's identical to this first one, except the shift in language. We can see, right, the actual instructions here you can see are identical, but the difference is the title and the description. So summarize an audio clip versus a 2 to 3 minute research survey, answer 3 brief research questions. So those are the permutations of the hit in round 1. And each one only asks for 5 responses. So what that means is each type of content, each of the 4 types of content is going to get 30 total responses, because each one of these is 5, right? 5 at the level of $1 for task focus, 5 here, right? 5 here. So this percolates upward to give you for each category 30 total options. And, I was kind of thinking about that because in the original formulation, we were getting 50, but I've always kind of wondered about this because the number of options we get, I wonder if at some point you're going to be splitting hairs. So, in round 2, people are going to be looking at these options and making a determination about which one is the most readable. The way they're doing that is getting 4 of them and then essentially randomly. Although it's not completely random because we want to make sure each one is being represented an equal number of times. So it's not truly random. Otherwise, there'd be a disparity in the number of times each option is provided. So anywho, all that is to say, the number of options there, like let's say we had, 100 of these. The thing of it is, it's like, I wonder the degree to which some of those would be very similar. So,
yeah,
people could vote on them, but, if you're more or less kind of splitting the vote, there's sort of a trade-off here in terms of, if you had 100, if you had 1,000, if you had 10,000, the distinctions between those, or, even the chance for straight up replication goes up, right? So there's a trade-off here in terms of the number of options and their distinctions, the distinctions between the options. Anywho, so in thinking of this, I thought, although I don't have a fantastic reason for why to pick one number rather than the other than that seems like a good scatter. And it wouldn't start to be too many. So like if we doubled this and we got 10 of them, then we'd have 60 options per content type. And at that point, I would start to wonder, we could probably tell when we read through them, it's like, well, a lot of these are semantically identical. So, it could even start to impact findings in the sense of splitting the vote in particular ways. Anywho, That's, I think, kind of a fine grain concern. But
Yeah, and it's and one we yeah, that's less of an issue now and just might be. I mean, we're not punting it, but it's also we'll see what we get from the results.
yeah, and I mean, truth be told, we could always. I don't think there'd be any problem with if it on the back end of round one, if we didn't feel there was an appropriate scatter, run it again. But anyway, as things stand, they're 5 each. And so you can kind of crunch the numbers on that because we're talking about, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 at the, $1 compensation level. So you're talking about, 40 there. And then at there's also 8 at $2. So that would be, $80. And then there's 8 at 150, 8 times 5 at 150. We're talking $60. So we're looking at, $180, which isn't a lot. But then, of course, we have fees from Amazon associated with that.
Oh, that's right. It's got to get its beak wet.
What's that?
Amazon's got to get its beak wet.
Yes, just so. We might miss some additional fees, though, because there are additional fees if you are seeking a higher number of replies. So because these are actually broken up into separate hits, we may actually dodge, not that it was a major concern, but we may dodge some fees, but there are standard fees anyway. But anywho, go ahead.
Quick question. Can you go back to that image?
The actual media or
no, the flow chart, as it were, of the hits. I'm thinking about, is there a way to think about the timing of this? So like when these will go up, because we talked about last time not wanting the higher amounts to overlap. I guess we'll be
IRB. That's in the IRB, which is essentially probably the most feasible one is to release the ones that are of the same compensation, probably simultaneously.
Okay.
Or close to one another, if not truly at the same time. You'd probably want to go in waves at compensation level, right? Do the $1 ones, then later do the 150s and the 2. You probably don't want to mingle things of different compensation level, because it potentially sets up a situation that asks for differentiation that isn't there. I mean, it's like if you have the same thing offered for $1 and $2, it's sort of like, why is one this and why is one that? And the only real answer there is to see what you do. So what's that?
The experiment design is the only difference as far as a Turker would see.
Correct.
Or I guess how we.
Yeah. Whereas, if you see two things that have slightly different titles and descriptions, but are both $1, that doesn't seem like an issue. And if they're different types of media, that clearly isn't an issue because you're asking for different stuff. So the waves should be based around compensation. So that does suggest that there'd be sort of 3 main waves, but I don't think that'll be an issue.
No. Yeah, we talked about that last time too, given that from an IRB standpoint, every Turker will have an equal shot at all 3 waves. So there's no trouble there IRB wise.
Yeah, that's in the thing, is that there isn't a situation where one person gets $1 and one person gets $2 for literally the same thing, because everyone has the opportunity to do all of the permutations, but they can only do one. Now, this does present the possibility that the same 5 could, in theory, do all of the round 1 responses, right? The same 5 responders could, in theory, do, since there's only 5 each time, they could do 5, then move on to the next. Now, because these are going to be staggered, the chances of that are lower, but they're possible. And I thought about this, then I'm not sure that's a big deal, because that's the platform. I mean, it's like, if you force it to say, well, no, we want some people who don't get first crack at it, it's like, well, that you can do that, but that's an artificial construct. That'd be like, it'd be like doing an experiment in nature where it's like, well, no, I want to take the baby turtles that would get eaten and put them in the ocean to see what happens. It's like, well, but that's not what happens. Those baby turtles get eaten, right? I mean, a lot of them get eaten. That's what happens. If you take the ones that would get eaten and throw them in the ocean, that's not what happens. The same is true here, where it's like, you can't privilege and say, well, no, we need some way to make sure we get these other. It's like, well, no, it's not how the platform works.
It's not how it works. Yeah, if the same people do it, then that's
what you get.
Then that's what happens, and that's what we work with, because that's the nature of. Yeah, I mean, right. It's the whole. I mean, right. Going back to the story of the Mechanical Turk, right? How many different people were inside the cabinet is not really what the point, right? It's
Well, and here,
which is yeah.
Well, and here, if we were a different requester and you were doing a similar task, you'd be in the same scenario, right? I mean, and there are actually ways to prevent this, but I'm not going to do them. I mean, basically the way it's going to be structured is you can only do one per thing, but one response per permutation, but you can do all of the permutations, but they won't be all simultaneous. So there's also the chance there for just natural scatter, that, this person was on during these hours, so they had first crack at these, but this other person was on during other hours. Yeah, I mean, I do anticipate some degree of overlap. Another thing also is I didn't want to track that for IRB purposes as well, because if you're even conscious of the fact that the same person is doing all of these, that means you are collecting some version of personal data. And that was another thing, is like, no, I'm not retaining that to make cross comparisons about who responded. Anywho.
Yeah, because in many ways, you could see that being an issue if someone's using mTurk to do, like sociological or psychological research, right? They don't want the same person filling it over and over again, but that's not what we're testing. So that's not really an issue for us. Like, we get what mTurk gives us, that for both IRB reasons, but also just our interest in this research is we're interested in hits, not necessarily whether or not the same person's doing the hit, because that's not our unit, as we talked about last time when you did the sort of trajectory of what's the sort of base unit for orality and literacy. And
well, and it maybe speaks to the difference here, because if you wanted like psychological profiles, an easy way would be the same survey, but a whole, open it up to a whole lot of responses, say 1,000, 10,000 responses, but the same survey. And then you can just make sure that, and you can actually set this, only one response, you're only able to do one response in that gigantic hit, right? Whereas here we have multiple hits, but fewer responses per hit, because we're interested precisely in the differences in these versions, right? I mean, we're examining what happens when you have different instructional language or recruiting language, really. What happens when you have different compensation levels? So as such, we're not, I mean, it's like if we were doing a psych profile, you'd only want one response. And so you just have the one version, and then you'd have 1,000 slots. Here, we're interested in the platform, not the responder. So we have multiple versions and fewer responses per version. I mean, we technically could, have a whole bunch of responses per version, but we're going to, you'd end up with, for each of those 4 categories of information type, you'd have a ton more responses. And then when you feed them into round 2, you could do it. It's just, as I mentioned, I wonder the degree to which you'd get diminishing returns. If you have 1,000 one-sentence summaries of that sample image or paragraph or 20-second clip, is there meaningful differentiation among them? Yeah. Anywho.
So so I guess to rephrase what you just said, we may only need 30 responses to get enough range, and if we go to 100, we won't get any. We'll just get more responses, but more of the same. Like, I don't know. Hypothetically, there's 5 possible summaries to get written. We could probably get those with 30.
Yes. Well, and there's the potential, and it's not even the case that it's not necessarily the case that it's like, well, more is fine because the best one's going to come out in the wash. But it's like, well, no, potentially you could have vote splitting where, I mean, say, for example, you have 2 that are very similar, but in a sense, very readable, whatever that means. I don't really have a predetermined conclusion about what that means, but I mean, like, imagine a vote for candidates where you've got, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and then Joe Biden 2, right? Who is his clone.
Right.
It's like, well, those guys are going to split the vote because they're identical. And then you've got this other one that's very different, that's going to get all of that kind of vote. You run the potential of, if you flood this with other answers, it's going to change. It's not innocuous just to have more and say, well, the best will rise to the top. It's like, well, but it's possible you're going to have vote splitting because 2 of these are good, whatever good means. The only difference is there's one preposition where the person says of and this person says to. Otherwise, they're literally identical.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a conceptual problem. It's not just, if it were just a scale problem, it'd be easy, but it's not. It's a conceptual problem. What happens when you crank up the scale?
Yeah. Right. You end up with Joe and Joseph Biden.
Right.
And it's just like, then right, we potentially miss that because it's split and doesn't rise to the level of significance.
Anywho, yeah. So that's kind of the gist there. The round 2 ones are, in a sense, simpler because those are just focused on the content types, which does mean, right? So all of these different permutations are getting fed into, these 4 sort of larger categories for round 2. So we will have summaries that are written at multiple compensation levels and targeted towards these different title and descriptions. You could say, well, wait, shouldn't you separate all these out and see which is the best one? And I think the answer is no. You shouldn't see which is the best or most readable one for each possible permutation, because what we want to get at is the differences, right? So, for example, let's say, 3 of them bubble to the top of this, and you could see something like, well, are those all $2 compensation ones, or are they all ones that are focused in this category, the ones that come from task or the ones that come from here? It's like, in order to see that difference, you have to combine them. So this is one way to do that, rather than, trying to select out the best or the most readable, I should say. For each one of these, it's like, well, no, throw them together into these categories and then see which one is the, winner, as it were.
So an idea would be is that we'd start from those when we collect. We'd start from the circles and then move back up into the Big Bend, and then when we looked at them, see if we could then put them back to see if we could tell based on how they've been selected. I think I lost that description. It made more sense in my when I used the gestures, but right, we want to pull them all back together so that then when we see which of those descriptions of the image, if there's any correlation to those differences down line.
Yeah. We'll have although we won't retain who wrote them, we will have those other things. It's associated with either the time focused or task focused language, it's discompensation level. So yes,
right.
After round 2, which is really just focused on identifying which of those summaries is most readable for the 4 types, then we can look at, say, for example, in each of those 4 categories, there's sort of a clear one that was selected as most readable. We could look at it and say, okay, well, where did this come from? Yes, further down the line. Well, this one is $2 compensated and focused on, the task language. It came from the time language, or the task language rather than the time language. Whereas, maybe the second and third vote getter are here and here. There may be a connection there. There may not. I mean, intuitively, you might say, well, all the ones that are higher compensated are going to get picked because people are going to spend more time and it's going to attract a better, someone who's more adept at doing this task. That might be your gut reaction. I don't know if that's what you're actually going to see, but this will allow us to do what?
Yeah, this is one of our Cadillac summaries.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, if there was a huge disparity there, that may not be a bad intuition. If it's like, offering pennies versus offering, $10, potentially.
If it's for.
What's that?
Yeah, for $2, I might revise this once. I might give it a second read.
Yeah, I mean, potentially you could see differences there, although I think in order to tease that out, you'd have to sort of radically change the structure of the hit. I mean, since the task is essentially the same, it's not like one task is saying, okay, we're gonna read your draft before we accept your, what I mean? It's like, I think you'd have to structure the task differently in order to see that kind of disparity. I don't know.
That would be, I know we don't want to do, but that would be interesting, right? Given again, we're coming from the discipline that we're in, right? You could imagine kind of, a parallel, right? We're kind of coming at this largely from a rhetorical standpoint, but I could also see someone in like composition or writing studies being interested in that distinction, right? If there's mention of revision or drafting in the task, does that change what you get?
Yeah, or even if you do it, because you can set this up where the pay is low, but there's the chance for a bonus, right? So imagine if it were structured such that you get a nominal fee for doing it, but there's a bonus associated with if what you do is in some way, if what you do is the winning vote getter, you get a bonus, right? That would change the nature of the task where, if we say, if you win that, I don't know how you'd communicate that, but it's like, if you win the second round, you get a bonus because obviously you did a better job, then potentially that would shape the task. That's the thing. It's like, there's probably literally infinite ways to modify the hit language and then see what pops out, Yeah,
it would also be interesting too, if you could do a lot of what we saw were some of those free or penny level ones that were basically
qualifiers.
Write a good enough description of this, and then you'll move on to the, select group that then gets, right, if we wanted to add like a middle stage, we got the middle stage where then if you write a good enough description at this level, you then get to write more that we then use for what we have for our second round. I mean, I don't think we should do that, but that would be another interesting build in yeah.
Well, so one way to think of that kind of thing also is it's one of the things we would address in a conclusion. It's one of the limitations of the study, right? As I've been talking with students about, limitations aren't failures. It's just, it's literally impossible to do everything simultaneously. I was reading some student analyses of things, and they often view limitations as, well, this scholarship seemed to do what it said it was going to do, so it doesn't have limitations. Like, well, limitations are, well, we can only answer a particular question here. So one thing to look at in the conclusion could be, if you were to take this further, what you might do is do something like a different pay structure that's based on, the bonus, get the bonus situation straightened out, where you're offering a low or, a fair but not overwhelming amount of compensation, but with the promise of a higher bonus. And you articulate, you have a bonus of up to whatever if your work is selected by other Turkers as being, one of the most effective summaries. Yeah. I mean, it's a separate thing. I mean, I don't think you'd want to do all these things at once, but it's something you could identify as an avenue for future research, because it would get at something that this one can't get at.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, the whole bonus thing is not what we're. Yeah, we just want to get a first pass at what readability is, and then sorting that in a second round. So. Yeah.
Anywho, but I mean, it's something to put a pin in terms of, material for a conclusion, talking about future avenues, right? Limitations and ways to address those. Anywho, we should probably move on. So the second, and I think we took a quick look at this, but the second round was, these are all identical. There's only four types. They're all identical, except for the type of media they address. And so the language here is uniform. It basically asks you to choose a readable one-sentence summary of the provided whatever. You'll be given whatever and asked to select the most readable summary of it from a list of 4 options composed in previous hits. There are no wrong answers. Task should take less than 2 minutes. And then it has the standard language, standard instructional language here. This does retain, and we talked about this last time, this does retain these second 2 questions that ask for a rating of instructional clarity and compensation fairness, and then a sentence that explains your rating. Now, in the first round, we are probably going to read these answers 2 and 3 because they do ask for a sentence. We're probably going to read those more closely than in this second round, because this second round is at such a higher scale. You probably couldn't feasibly read and comprehend and get your arms around each one of them just by reading. We would have the option to take these sentences and do some minor text mining on them, as we did in the first product, just to see what people are talking about. But these, as we talked about, also serve other purposes, like they help ensure that you're getting a person who speaks English. So those 2 things, a person and someone who speaks English, it helps ensure that. Because this is asking for, the most readable summary, we do kind of want 1, humans, at least primarily, and 2, humans who speak English, because that you kind of need that for this question.
Yeah. But it's still interesting, right? I mean, all the potentially some of the controls we can build in, but given the nature of Turks, we'll never quite know how this is being generated, which is an interesting, legacy of the Mechanical Turk.
Yeah, and which is fine. If bots slip in there, that's how it is, right? So, there is language in the thing saying to get compensation, you have to complete all three questions. So there is language to not compensate ones. Although, as I put in the IRB, the goal is to provide compensation. I don't think we want to, nor would we sort of have sort of the ability to really go through these with a fine-tooth comb. So really, like the only real criterion is, did you complete it? Right. So a sentence would constitute completion. However, that sentence could be nonsensical, and I'm still going to pay you. That's even true in the first round. I put that in the IRB as well, that unless the language there is threatening or obscene, then we intend to keep the responses, even if they seem like off base. Like if someone's summary is, a dog drinks from its water dish, right? It's like, no, I'll keep that one. Yeah. It's, it doesn't pertain, but, I'll keep it. The ones we wouldn't keep are, and I don't think this would happen, but it might, ones that have threatening or obscene language. Two reasons. One, because we're reprinting these, Mechanical Turk itself has guidelines about that you can't, unless you actually, mark it specially as being a adult, which did come up in our first product, right? There were some that were, signified adult content. So there actually are sort of like guidelines about what you can and can't do in terms of language. And just to sidestep that, it's like, well, then we'll just pull them out, right? I mean, if there's one that says, a whole bunch of racial slurs and then makes a personal threat, it's like, we'll just pull it out. I'm not going to do that. Yeah. But then also for IRB purposes, I wouldn't want to just reprint those sight unseen and then have someone in the second round be confronted with something that they weren't prepared for because our language didn't prep them for that, right? So in the IRB, that's what
given and given the nature of the media, I don't want my feelings hurt.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just sort of like, it's just part of this is doing the actual labor. I mean, it is a collaborative process. But anywho, so that's in the IRB, that it's like the only thing I said we'd pull out are ones that are like that, but otherwise keep them in, because ideally, the built-in sorting mechanism, if it's saying this image shows a dog drinking from its water bowl, it's like, well, people shouldn't select that one seemingly, because it's not,
That's part of the design of the experiment. Then that one would get ranked lower as on terms of readability.
And if it doesn't, I mean, that also is informative, right? I mean, we don't really have a goal here of, that's the thing. It's like, it's not like we're doing this to tune a machine learning algorithm where it's like, oh, I sure hope they pick this one. I sure hope they do. I don't care. Pick whatever you want.
Pick the dog one.
That's still a valid result. I mean, it's in some ways, it's probably a more interesting one. How did that one get traction? Anywho. And we should move on. So I'm going to submit, I sent you a copy, although I'll send you an updated copy because there's been changes. I'll probably fire that off today. I mean, there's the only thing that I was kind of waiting on was making these hits, which took longer than I anticipated. It's just like a lot of Turk labor, honestly. I mean, I had to do all this replication and then checking to make, because I mean, there's like minor differences between them. It's like, there's 24 versions and some of them are only different based on compensation amount. Some of them are only different based on, the kind of thing. So it's just like a lot of grunt work.
Yeah.
All right. So thinking about the first product there, which we did want to touch upon. So let me pull this up, I guess. I provided some, let me just, sorry, I can't do two things at once. There we go. So, we were folding in those comments, and
Yeah.
I put together this revised outline here, and you can see the ones that have strike throughs are, that's where we've gotten. So I wrote up, new content that helps contextualize what we're doing. It leads up to this comment you had here. It's really sort of this point where we're looking at, there's been stuff in other fields. There's an ongoing interdisciplinary conversation, but at this point where it's like not really anything directly in rhetoric. And so you had this comment here about, I think, Jim Brown's material. And so I think we're sort of at the point where that would go.
Yeah. And I've started to, I've collected, my normal writing process, I've collected lots of quotes to work with. But yeah, so I think I just need to do this. But yeah, I think that gets us. And I think then as we talked about too, kind of everything we build in the introduction is going to be doing, 2 or 3 jobs, right? The idea of at this point addressing related work in rhetoric then also helps us additionally frame the kind of so what question in terms of rhetoric's relationship to this and its potential contributions to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we can kind of see in the outline, those kinds of issues, right? I mean, I think like this kind of section. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, right, that bolded bullet point just over there is where one of the things we talked about when we last talked about the introduction is, raising some of those larger questions that we had sort of tagged for the third project.
Yeah.
But recognizing that we'll need to broach those in this introduction. So I think, right, this broader mechanical Turks project, which I think will help with some of the questions, some of the comments we got on, particularly how we're relating it to these, new materialists and post-human conversations.
Well, and even there were some comments about pointing out that, there are lots of other things at stake in MTurks, ethical questions, lots of other things at stake that we don't really bring up, which was intentional, but we didn't clarify that intent, right? I mean, we were only looking at that piece because you can't really pull on that thread and not have it all come with you, right? I mean, if you start talking about the Orientalism embedded in the name, that in itself is a paper, right? I mean, it's not a comment to make in this text mining one. So there are all these larger issues at stake, as we suggest in the broader project, which has an aim and a method, a collaborative method, which will be discussed in the subsequent methods section. But this one has its own kind of limited purview.
But I think there's a way of, what we can do is kind of, as we're doing these talks, sort of show our work, right? That we're, rather than just skipping over them, we can tag them and note them and then focus in on what we're after in this particular piece.
Right. And you can see, I mean, the intro much of it is this contextualization. I think, I mean, at least I did it. I don't know if it's, I don't know if it's good, but it's there. There aren't a ton of moves remaining in the introduction, I don't think, where, we talk about the field and what the field potentially could contribute to this interdisciplinary discourse, acknowledgement of larger issues at stake in Mechanical Turk, and then the purview of this one, right, which is focused explicitly on language, right, a sort of core rhetoric concern, and why we used, therefore, text mining.
Yeah.
And as it points out, right, as Kathleen mentioned, kind of repeatedly, it's like, is what you're doing a version of what you're studying, right? In so many words, is what you're doing similar to these acts that you're examining? And indeed, yes, right? So at least they nod to this, although most of this, I think, will be handled in the methods section. But at least, this is probably a one sentence statement.
Well, and given that I'm going to use Jim Brown's ethical programs to get into this, right, that's also how it can answer this, which is, his three-part distinction between arguing about, with, and in software is that's a piece of this, right? That's essentially, we are doing that because we're not simply arguing about Mechanical Turks. We're not arguing with Mechanical Turks, because that's, I think, one of the ways I want to describe that is that's the common way in which the social sciences have used Mechanical Turks, right? They've used it as a way to make an argument, insofar as they're using it as a research tool to help them make a case about something. And so part of what we're interested in, and I think this is what draws us to the Turk in particular, is what's happening in the Turk, right? So so in any ways, we're not arguing about, here's what Mechanical Turk says a human is, and we want to critique that in some way, right? Because that's what we talked about, right? That's this move about using a kind of essentialist notion of a human to critique what's happening in Mechanical Turk. We're not interested in making arguments Mechanical Turks, because we're not interested, like we said earlier in our previous discussion, right, that we don't actually care about that, because we're not using them to make some claim about readability. So we're not arguing with Mechanical Turks. So in that extent, Kathleen's question is precisely what we're interested in. We're interested in getting into Mechanical Turks and seeing what's happening in it. And to do that, we have to get in it. And so in that sense, yes, we are doing Mechanical Turks, because our method is, we want to see how it's defining the human, and we're not interested in talking about that, and we're not interested in arguing with it. We're interested in getting in it, arguing in it. So I think that's why that Jim's distinction early in his book is a way to actually, all those unstriped through parts of the introduction, I think, will all fit in that framework nicely.
Okay.
And so that helps organize it. But there's also a sense in which that also then helps us with our own audience issues.
Yeah.
Which is, here's the move of why this is important to rhetoric has already been made in other places. So there's also, I think, a way for us to not make bigger claims, while also pitching this in terms that are already, extant in the field.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to the more collaborative piece, right? I mean, if part of what we're interested in with this project is doing collaborative research, I think it also makes sense to, I think, conceptually, ethically pitch our introduction in someone else's terms that they've already developed. I think that also speaks to the kind of collaborative, right? We've talked to Jim, and we're now also going to talk with his terms, which also happen to address a lot of the questions that we got asked in the comments.
Yeah, we could include, additional video clips of maybe of our conversation with him that might be pertinent to that. Because remember, the sort of last stage of revision is providing inset embedded video clips that are pertinent. So that might be a way to.
So I think yeah, and so I will go back, and as I'm working on this, I will go back and watch that conversation with Jim to see if there's stuff, you know, that he points to that I could follow up on, but also tag some things that will, you know, map onto the part of the introduction where we're using his book.
Yeah, and so you know, that'll lead us up to our findings, right? I mean, our thesis, our assertion here, and then, you know, as it points out how they're qualified, right? Perhaps most importantly, what the study does is point the way to subsequent ones that move outside of hit language and engage Turker interaction and theoretical concerns that's setting up later pieces. Hold on real quick.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We can come
so
to that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just saying, and again, we can come back to that, right? If part of the setup of the introduction is that notion of arguing in software, then part of our conclusion is we're going further in.
Yeah. Okay. So that'll, you know, take us through the introduction. I might start working on the revising the methods section. And, you know, there may be, you know, I was a little hesitant for that about that because, you know, the dots may not perfectly connect, but I'm less concerned. You know, we'll make the dots fit. So I might move forward and start revising the methods section based on the feedback we got. All right. Well, I know you have to wrap up. So I think that's the kind of gist. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we're good. And I submitted additional possibility of additional monies. They've got it and they're reviewing it. So we'll see. It might be extra, give us something to some fun money to play with if in case we want to revisit some of these hits. Maybe it will be good to have that. So
yeah, yeah, we can definitely think about that. So yeah, I guess in the immediate future, I'm going to submit the IRB application probably today, I would guess, and then we can work on revising these two things in the first product.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. I will talk to you later.
All right. Bye.
See ya.